Alright, let's keep on going here. Um, so we're going to start talking about the Passeriformes. So these are birds known as passerines or perching birds. So it's the most diverse order of birds. It has 59 families and about 5,100 species, although this number is constantly changing because a lot of new species are being described and some species unfortunately are disappearing. And this one order comprises about 75% of all described bird species. And don't worry, I'm not going to have you learn all of them, but I want you to learn some of the more common families and species. So we're actually going to cover the remainder of this lab, and then the 2 additional labs following us will all be focused on this one order. So in North America, many of these are neotropical migrants, but there's a lot of resident birds as well. So all passerines have anisodactyl foot arrangement. This means there's 3 toes forward, 1 behind. This is in part why they're known as perching birds. So these are birds that are very good at perching on twigs and fences and power lines and you name it, any round surface they're able to perch on quite well. So many species of passerines are very small, like 10 centimeters in total length, but some can be quite large. So common ravens are 75 to 80 centimeters sometimes. So very, very large range in body size here. A lot of them are insectivorous or frugivorous, but a lot of them are also scavengers. There are some almost strictly predatory species. It's really quite variable. But one of the things that unites them is that they're all quite vocal. And some species are actually highly developed for calling, and they have a really highly developed syrinx, so part of the, often called the voice box. So it's part of their trachea, but it allows them to make really elaborate ranges of sounds. And these are often called aucenes. And then birds that don't have quite the same development are known as sub-aucenes. And so you often hear the passerines referred to as songbirds, but they're not the only birds that really sing, nor are they effectively all birds that sing. Like, you can go outside and you can hear a crow calling. It's not so much a song as just a vocalization. And so the term songbirds is somewhat misleading here, and it's just one you want to be cautious of because it's thrown around a lot. But it really only applies to a subset of passerines, but also some other birds, like the cuckoos can have really elaborate calls sometimes, but they're in a whole different order. Okay, and I mentioned many of these are neotropical migrants, so this is the eastern wood pewee, found throughout the eastern half of North America, overwinters northern parts of South America, migrates through through Central America and the Caribbean. And so this is a very common trait among many of the passerines, and a lot of their conservation is reliant upon habitats in the breeding area, the wintering area, and then adequate migration habitats throughout. And so there really are a lot of threats facing these birds in their annual cycle. So again, we're talking about this little group here, these top 3 rows, Passeriformes, and we've already covered everything else. So now we're just going to dive into more detail here. So what this looks like is we're going to be diving into a new phylogeny, looking at different types of passerines. And you'll notice that this boundary about 65 million years ago is kind of where this started, right? And so right in here, then you've got some of these sub-aucenes. Remember, these are the birds that aren't as good at singing as some of the others. And then you've got these aucenes and some of these more elaborate birds. And interestingly, the coloration here refers to the current ranges of a lot of these species, where they're actually located. So in green, these are Africa and Eurasia. Blue are North and South America, and then the red are kind of Australasia areas. And so really you see huge variation, but even within some of these larger groups, like this group here, you see New World jays, corvids, and the Virionidae, birds known as vireos, so we'll talk about them as well. But you see some spatial variation within these larger groups, and so there's a lot going on here among all of these passerines. So these up at the very top are what can truly be called songbirds, but not all of them, of course, and then some of these others are not nearly as adept at calling. So things to look for here: the plumage is your single best way to distinguish the passerines. The shape, color, and dimensions of the bill, overall size relative to the body, etc. Those can be really useful. The songs are often sometimes the only distinguishable way to tell species apart. And this is really tough because a lot of them have songs that seem very similar. Some of the times they have calls that overlap widely among species, some chirps, etc. But then they'll have a specific song that's unique to that species. And so the only way to distinguish them is to just learn all the songs and then try to figure them out that way. It's very difficult. They have anisodactyl feet, as I mentioned before. And then another way to tell them apart is to look for the presence or absence of various characteristics. So rictal bristles, supercilia, spots, barring, etc. Any of the features that we've talked about pretty much through the entire semester can be really useful for teasing out different passerines from one another. Okay, we're going to start talking about the family Tyrannidae. These are the tyrant flycatchers. And the name tyrant comes from the fact that they tend to be quite aggressive towards each other and towards other birds. So the tyrannids have large heads relative to their body. Most species have rictal bristles. Remember, these are the bristles that the caprimulgids have. And so they're these stiff feathers around the bill that actually help push prey into their bill. So many species have pretty drab plumage that's not great for ID. I have I've selected specimens that are much easier to identify visually than a lot in this family, so you should just be aware that there are a lot of tyrannids that are not easy to tease out. So their behavior, their calls, and their general shape are often pretty good diagnostics. A lot of diversity worldwide. There's 44 species in North America. We're going to cover a handful of them. So the first one is the eastern phoebe. This is a very common eastern species, pretty much found out to the Rockies in the mountains. Generally wetland associated, but not exclusively. Any place that has a lot of insects can have phoebes. They do extend up into the boreal forest as well, but very common here, almost year-round. Not real common to see in the dead of winter here, but otherwise pretty much found year-round. They showed up in Carbondale a few weeks ago, and they've been here since. Overall, they're this kind of grayish-brown bird with paler underparts and darker upper parts. They're going to have this light-colored chin, and then this kind of dark cap, and a fairly straight bill with a slightly rounded tip. If you look very closely, it's a little difficult in these pictures, but they do have rictal bristles. They're just very hard to spot unless you get a real good look at them in the right light. But phoebes bob their tail very rapidly when they perch, and they tend to fly out and kind of flutter around and grab prey and then fly back to the same perch. And so you often see them do these quick little zipping flights out and then come back, and they'll perch and they'll flop their tail. So it's just this constant tail bobbing. And that's really a good way to identify phoebes from others. The other way is to listen for this.
Eastern phoebe.
So it's this kind of four-part call. It's phoebe, phoebe. So the second part of that note is almost like a question. What's phoebe? Phoebe? and they will chirp as well. But again, remember that the chirps alone are very difficult for ID. But that Phoebe, kind of nasal way of saying Phoebe is very
Says
distinct.
Phoebe.
Okay. Another species is the great crested flycatcher. So this is a true neotropical migrant. So only found here during the summer. I have yet to see any, but they'll be showing up very soon, I'm sure. So great crested flycatchers kind of have a tricolored appearance. When you see them, they tend to see this gray head, and you can see the rictal bristles here around this one. And they have a more pointed bill with kind of a hook at the tip. And that's true of a lot of the pteranids. You can see it's kind of triangular from underneath. And so it gives them a very wide gape, so they're able to eat fairly large prey. And that's true of a lot of the pteranids. But in the great crested flycatcher, you've got a gray head here, and then this yellow underside. So the majority of the abdomen, the lower breast, and underneath the rump are this kind of bright uniform yellow. And then the underside of the tail will be this rusty red, kind of rufous here. So it's gray, yellow, and then rufous. And in flight, they'll have some rufous showing on their wings as well. But really, this very clear, typical posture to see all three. The name comes from the fact that when they're excited, they have a crest that they're able to raise, but it's not always visible. So this bird is not particularly worked up about anything. The crest isn't visible. In this one, it's slightly visible, but not great, not really clear from this angle. So another species is the eastern kingbird. This is one that's fairly common, especially near water. It's overall this kind of very dark gray along the top of the head, the back, and then pale white underneath. You'll notice that it does have rictal bristles. That's a good way to tell it apart from, say, a swallow, which we'll talk about next week. And you'll notice that the tail it's a primarily dark tail underneath with a white tip. So the range, again, another full migrant, pretty much found throughout the majority of the lower 48, the exception of kind of the southwest and far western coastal areas. Eastern kingbirds also have two features that are kind of unique to them. On their head, they will have this bright, fiery crest, but you can only see it when they're presenting it, and they're basically from the front. So this is something that's very aggressive, territorial when you would see this, but it's very clear cut. If you can see a bird that's kind of gray and white, very dark gray and white, and has this fiery crest, it's an eastern kingbird. And you can also see they have kind of these slightly gray armpits here, so it's a little bit darker gray up underneath the wings than it is on the rest of the underside. Another species that's kind of fascinating is the scissor-tailed flycatcher. These are more found in open land areas. Very, very pretty birds. They're going to have kind of overall a pale gray appearance on the head, with a black bill and a slightly darker stripe going from the base of the bill through the eye, which you can see here. And then the majority of their undersides are going to be this kind of pinkish wash here, pleating out onto the tail. And there's especially a lot of pink visible right up at the base of the wings on the underside. So the underside of the wings, the back portion of the abdomen, and out onto the tail will all have this kind of bright pinkish appearance. The name comes from this really long forked tail. So just like the scissor-tailed kite, this is the scissor-tailed flycatcher. It's the same root meaning, and you see these black tips on the wings, or on the tail feathers, but very, very clearly, deeply forked here. Generally speaking, they are a full migrant, but they don't go as far as some, and they tend to be found in western Missouri, western Arkansas, Kansas. It's a state bird of Oklahoma, but every once in a while, one or two makes it to southern Illinois, and last summer there were quite a few around to be seen. So it's possible there may be some in southern Illinois this year. We'll wait and see. Okay. Another family I want you to know are the Linneidae. So these are birds known as shrikes. So shrikes are very stout, well-muscled birds. There are 3 species in North America, only 2 that I want you to know. And shrikes have a really diverse diet. They eat other birds, rodents, snakes, lizards, grasshoppers, and other invertebrates. But really, they are strictly predatory. So they're one of the few groups of passerines that are strictly predatory. They rarely will scavenge, but they pretty much hunt actively. So one of the common terms for shrikes are butcher birds, and this is because they actually will find shrubs or trees that have thorns, and they will actually impale their prey. So they'll catch prey, and they'll fly it back to their what is called a larder tree, so basically like a pantry, and they'll impale that prey on those thorns. And so it's kind of a morbid looking process, which is where the name butcher comes from, but it's quite effective, and it tends to hold over their supply of food for a long period of time. So one of the species I want you to learn is the loggerhead shrike. So all shrikes are going to be kind of gray, like darker gray above, lighter gray underneath, with this severely hooked bill here, but overall kind of a stocky, rugged posture. In the loggerhead shrike, they have this black bill, and then it extends right back into this black mask that goes over the face here. It covers the eye and onto the back of the head. Beneath that is kind of this light gray underside, but it's very clean. There's no barring, there's no other markings, just clean uniform gray here. And then the top of the head and onto the back will be a much darker gray, as you can see here. And then a lot of black and some white on the flight feathers. So loggerhead shrike is a more southerly distribution year-round throughout the southern half of the U.S., and then migrates further north during the summer to breed. Compare that to the northern shrike, which is primarily only found in the lower 48 during the winter, breeds in the far northern boreal areas of Canada and Alaska. So the northern shrike has a much less pronounced black eye stripe. It's still there, but it's narrower overall. And the best single way to tell them apart is that the northern shrike has a heavily barred breast, whereas the loggerhead shrike does not. So that's a really important way to tease them apart. And you can see this one's actually perched on some sort of rose shrub, and this is the kind of habitat that they would actually use to impale their prey on. And so if they caught a grasshopper or something, they would stab that onto that prey and leave it until they needed it later on. Okay, another family I'd like you to know are the vireos. This is family Virionidae. So vireo is a Latin term. It means I am green. And so vireos all tend to have a lot of greenish plumage to them. But this is kind of an olive, more camouflaged green, not vibrant green. And so all vireos are really cryptic and very difficult to see. They tend to forage and nest really high in the canopies, but they're also very vocal, and so often we'll hear vireos much more likely than we would be to see them. So there's 16 species in North America. We're going to cover a handful that are fairly common in southern Illinois. So first is the white-eyed vireo. So as the name implies, it has this very, very pale white iris around the eye. Overall, they're going to have a yellowish appearance, some on the face and a lot on the undersides, but it's not always this bright. So this individual has a very bright appearance. This individual here is much more subdued. Generally speaking, males are going to have bolder plumage than females, but there's a lot of variation within males and a lot of variation within females, but they're all going to have kind of this olive green upper portion and a more yellowish underside. But both sexes have this really clear white eye ring and these 2 bold white wing bars you can see here. And those are very important characteristics for the white-eyed vireo. So it's a fairly small bird, 5 inches in total length. All the vireos are fairly small, and it's found pretty much throughout the eastern half of the U.S. during the breeding season and then primarily along the Gulf of Mexico during the winter. Another species is the yellow-throated vireo. As the name implies, it has a bright yellow throat here. So underneath the chin and then down in the front of the neck, bright yellow. They have kind of an olive head, but they have a black eye. You notice that iris is entirely black here, and so that's a good indicator that it's not some of these other species. They will also have the 2 white wing bars, but clean white undersides. So the back half of the abdomen and under the flank here is clean white, and then the upper back and the upper wings are going to be uniform gray, not that olive that you'd see in the white-eyed vireo. Okay. Another common species is the red-eyed vireo, and as the name implies, it has a bright red iris here. You'll notice that you can see this bird has a slightly hooked bill, so all the vireos have a slightly hooked bill, but you have to get a really good look at them to tease that out. So the red-eyed vireo is kind of unique in that it has a gray cap and this very pale gray supercilium. So this very dark crown and then light supercilium above that red eye is very typical of the red-eyed vireo. So they're also going to have pretty clean undersides here, but then you'll notice the back and the upper portions of the wings and the tail are kind of overall this olive gray. Okay, and then another species that tends to be very vocal is called the warbling vireo. So this is a widespread species during the breeding season, but has a pretty contracted winter range, primarily in Mexico. But you'll notice it still has that gray cap, and then a lighter eye stripe here, or lighter supercilium, and then a dark eye stripe, but then it has kind of a yellowish wash on the upper abdomen and then onto the flanks here. But the underside, like kind of the central portion of the lower abdomen and onto the flank, tends to be more white. So overall, yellowish, greenish, no wing bars at all, but that dark cap and supercilium are still pretty visible. They're named for the call. They have this very elaborate,
warbling
kind of beautiful sounding song. So it's dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. So they tend to warble up and down in pitch, but it's many calls in very rapid succession, varying the pitch. And so with this song, they tend to do a number of these in repeat. They'll chatter, of course. So chatters and these sorts of things are difficult to tease out, but those songs are unique to each species. Okay, so the last family we're going to talk about today is the family Corvidae. And corvids include jays, crows, ravens, and kind of allies. So a lot of these birds, they all tend to be very aggressive, very intelligent birds that are extremely adaptable to human activities. So corvids tend to do very well around humans, a lot better than a lot of other birds. One thing that they do very well is destroy nests. So they're really adept nest predators. And this is true of ground nesting tundra birds that are susceptible to predation by ravens. Birds that nest in cups and thick, heavy brush are very susceptible to blue jays. So they're very adaptable, and they use a wide range of different habitats, but especially do well near humans. So a fair amount of diversity worldwide, about 20 species in North America. So this is a paper that came out last year where they were actually looking at the diversity of New World jays. So this is a subsection of this family Corvidae, and they actually found that there's a huge range of different species of jays with a lot of different variation in plumage. And interestingly, the majority of these are found in Central and South America, but some of these are very common in North America as well. So obviously our most common species right around here for jays is a blue jay. As the name implies, you've seen this before, but bright blue plumage of the crest, the upper back, the tail, and the wings. So the plumage on the tail and the wings is iridescent, and it really shines in different light. So most of the corvids have no difference in plumage among sexes, although they do vary in size, with males being considerably larger in some cases. But the plumage will be very similar in males and females. So everyone's seen blue jays now, very common, but that iridescent blue plumage is really unique to the blue jay. So here is their relative range, primarily the eastern half of the U.S. as far west as the Rockies, and a little bit up into the boreal forest, but when you get further west, blue jays are displaced by other species of jays. So here's the call for the blue jay you've heard before. So it's this nasal and a little higher pitch, but still kind of nasal. And they'll do these repeats. There'll be a few repetitions, the same thing. And you want to remember, of course, that blue jays, and honestly all corvids, will try to mimic other birds, especially predatory birds. Okay. Another species of jay is the gray jay. So this is recently was renamed the Canada jay, but it hasn't been well received, and so I'm still going to leave it in here as gray jay, although I'll accept Canada jay if that's what you put down. They're going to be roughly the same size as a blue jay, but a little bit stockier overall. They will have a dark gray cap, and the upper back will be dark gray, and then the underside will be pale gray, and generally palest and lightest colored right along kind of the sides of the face and underneath the chin. You'll notice they also have some of these bristly feathers at the base of the bill. These serve, you'll notice their range, they tend to be at quite high elevations or high latitudes. So they're generally found in areas where it gets fairly cold. And it's believed that these bristles actually help kind of filter the air and pre-treat the air so that they're not breathing in a lot of really cold air. And so it actually reduces a lot of their energy expenditure. Especially in the northwest portions of the range, in Alaska and far western Canada, they have a lot of much darker gray plumage along the back here. The further east you get, they tend to have a little bit paler plumage on the heads. In Alaska and Canada, they're often called camp robbers, so they're very mischievous around humans, and they learn that they can steal food very readily. So if you ever camp in an area with these, I strongly suggest that you have everything battened down and put away for the night, or else they will destroy it. They're very, very good at getting into people's stuff and causing problems. Take it from my personal experience. So another western species is the black-billed magpie. So these are a really cool, primarily black and white bird. From a distance, they're going to look black and white, but a lot of the plumage that looks black at first will actually have this really bold iridescence visible. So the upper tail, the entirety of the wings will have, and a lot of the plumage of the head and neck and upper breast are going to be this kind of iridescent bluish green, but it'll look very dark in flat light, but once you get in a brighter light you can see the variation in that. They're going to have a lot of white along the tops of the wings here, the primaries, and then the underside, like the core underside of the body, will be white as well. But widespread throughout the West and increasing. They're actually moving their range north in Alaska and the Yukon and even into the Northwest Territories and Nunavut a fair amount just recently. So another one that everyone's abundantly familiar with now is the American crow. Crows are an entirely black, fairly large bird. They're going to be somewhat stocky, but not real stocky, so some relatively slender compared to the common raven. They also have a very fanned tail. It's not diamond shaped. They're going to have a higher pitched call and a smaller size overall. So pretty much found throughout the lower 48 and up into Canada. There are some other species of crows that look superficially similar, but they'll use different habitats and they'll actually have very different calls. But I only want you to know the American crow here. So it's just that distinct caw, 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 caw. But it's kind of high-pitched and a little bit nasal. It's not caw, caw. It's caw, caw, caw. So here's the common raven. So common ravens can get very large. Say typically you're looking at, 2 feet in total length. But I've seen individuals that were probably closer to 2.5, maybe approaching, even approaching 3 feet. So they can be really variable. They tend to be largest in the northern and western portions of the range, and smaller the further south and east you go. You'll notice there's a huge gap in their distribution here. So they're found throughout the west in high desert areas, throughout the boreal forest and on the tundra here, but very few in the east. And they were extirpated from a lot of the eastern areas, and they're starting to move back in, and their populations are beginning to recover naturally. But there have always been extant populations in the Appalachians here. So ravens are very large birds. So they're distinguished from the crow by that diamond-shaped tail I mentioned again. They're much larger size and they're lower pitched call. So another good thing to look for is that they have these long feathers underneath the chin here. And generally when they're not perching and not displaying, you won't see that. But when they're perching, it'll become very clear. You'll see it very readily here. They also have this massive, massive bill. It's very, very heavy duty, very stout. Ravens are very stocky, muscular birds. But they have these bristles that extend over the nares. So the holes where the nostrils would be on the bill are completely covered by these bristles in ravens. And they're not in crows. So you can see the nares are just only slightly covered, often very visible, like you can see them here in this individual. But a much slender bill in the crow, or much more slender bill and a much heavier covered bill in the raven. So seeing them side by side, you can see the smaller, sleeker appearance of the crow and that fanned tail here. And the raven's very stocky posture overall, and that really distinct diamond-shaped tail, heavy bills as well. And this is a couple of years ago now, but they've actually had ravens nesting in Washington, D.C. For the first time in about 100 years, and they're actually doing fairly well. So they're starting to move back into areas where they were historically persecuted. There's a lot of cultural significance in northern cultures with ravens. Ravens are often the tricksters, Norse legends. They were a source of wisdom, but they were readily persecuted by a lot of farmers, and so they're beginning to recover. So hopefully they continue to do that. For me, I worked on ravens. One of my first major research projects I worked on was working with ravens, and yes, this is me without facial hair a long time ago. But we were working in the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay and trying to look at a population of ravens there that only existed because they nested on human-built infrastructure. So in the background you can see some of this drilling facility equipment. There are heated portions of these buildings, like exhaust ports, things like that, where the birds are able to survive year-round, and so they're able to capitalize on this new environment that people have created and take over, and we're now up to a population of roughly 100 pairs in an area where there really shouldn't be any ravens. And so we were trying to figure out how far these individuals were going on a day-to-day basis, which involved catching them and actually putting patagial tags. So I talked about those with condors. Here's one on a raven chick. So just before we wrap up, just kind of run through another batch of these. So this bird here has really long split tail feathers, has kind of a grayish appearance on the upper portion of the body, and then a lot of the underside that's visible is bright pink, especially these sections right up next to the wing. So that makes this a scissor-tailed flycatcher. Then this is a kind of uniformly gray and brown bird, darker above, pale below, kind of dark in the armpits here. And this would be bobbing its tail readily. So this is an eastern phoebe here. This bird has a black eye, lots of yellow on the upper portion of the body, and then kind of an olive appearance to the back of the head, a hooked bill, and then 2 white wing bars. And so of all the birds we've covered, this would be the yellow-throated vireo. And this one here, this is a fairly large, mostly gray bird, much darker above, but uniformly gray underneath, with the palest portion of gray up onto the face and the throat. This will be found primarily in the boreal forest. This is a Canada jay, or a gray jay. And then this species here, it's got a heavily barred breast, has a narrow black eye stripe leading from this heavily hooked bill back, and then gray along the top of the head and the upper back, and then black flight feathers. So this is a northern shrike. Okay, so we're going to end there, and we will resume next week with some more material about passerines.